Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are Team 2. My name is Ansel Croft.
My name is Morgan Ando.
My name is Taylor McNichol.
I'm Riley Lang.
I'm Graham Keynes. And now we're going to turn it back to Ansel to introduce the trends.
So basically, based on our studies, we found two main trends in the radio industry. The first is content change. When we, according to our research about radio industry, we found many radio companies, they not only into broadcasting music, but also other type of content, such as talk show. And it kind of an efficient way to bring a unique and huge competitors force between other competitors. So other second trends is the data mining, which is also called data fiction. So customization advertising is an effective feed-based tool that inject all the dramatic information to our customer. For example, when I search some SLR camera on Best Buy or Amazon, so after that, I found all the further web page, just like magic, just some relative ads just appear in my web. So it's kind of efficient way to reach our target market, but also reduce the time to connect to our right and the potential customers. So the second section, Morgan will introduce 4 criteria.
So I'll be talking about the criteria. Our first criteria is financial performance, which measures the company's overall health. We then use the operating margin ratio to conclude that the higher the operating profit margin, the more successful a company is by paying their debt obligations. Our next criteria is online streaming, which allows for our content to be broadcasted all over the world instead of just within radio signals. And then this content allows for more listeners because there is a lot more content than just radio, and allows for more customization because they have so much content. Our next criteria is advertising, which the advertisers are reaching more into the data mining, which then targets and attracts more consumers because they are being targeted. And since advertisers are targeting each millennial or demographic, then they can if humans were to do this, then they would attract more as they are targeting other users. Our next criteria is technology, which we talked about 2 major technologies. One is our smartphones, because smartphones are increasing tremendously, so they are allowing more online streaming because their smartphones connect to their cars and speakers. And then our next technology was satellite in cars, because since car technology is increasing, there's more satellite radios being built into their cars, so more people would listen to their satellite radios instead of their normal traditional radio. And I'll be passing on to Taylor to talk about our first recommendation.
So through analysis and research in the industry, we were able to look at trends and make criteria for our recommendations. Our recommendations are to invest in a music streaming app, contract in popular podcasters, and also create partnerships. So the first recommendation for the music streaming app, we came to this conclusion for the recommendation because of the rising popularity. At the end of 2016, 80% of millennials used some sort of music streaming app, compared to globally, it was 77%. Also within the company Cumulus, between the years of 2014 to 2016, witnessed a decrease in 9.35% in revenues. So by having a music streaming app with subscriptions, we would then be able to create a steady income of cash flows. The app features would have custom playlists, music videos, podcasts, recommended songs, and top charts. And also, to compete with others in the industry, we would like to have as many songs as possible because there is no fee for having unlimited songs on there. You only get charged for the streaming fees and the royalties. So our initial cost would be $185,000. We would like to go with a multi-platform app so it could be compatible with iOS, Android, and a desktop. It, on average in the United States, is $50 an hour to hire an outside developing firm compared to overseas, which is a little less, around $45 an hour. But we would like to stay in the United States so we can have closer contact with the developers. If the developing firm would have 5 employees working on this project, it would take approximately 3,700 hours to complete, which is 19 weeks. So the operating cost, it's 5 cents per gigabyte streamed. The music licensing costs are 12 cents per track played, and then the hosting cost is 1 cent per gigabyte. And then finally, for the revenues, currently on average within the industry, each listener is bringing in $2.25 in revenues. We would charge $9.99 per month just to stay competitive with other apps in the industry. And currently, the industry average is a variable cost ratio of 80%, which means for every dollar you make in revenues, there's 80 cents in cost. So although this app is not bringing in a huge amount of revenues, the state Cumulus is in now, they could use the cash on hand, and this would be a great way to do that. I will now introduce Riley to introduce a recommendation.
All right, so the next recommendation that we really want to touch on is the podcasting market. So through the next 4 years, podcast listenership is expected to increase at a rate of 67%. Broken down into a yearly figure, this would be around a 15%, and online listenership is only supposed to increase at 12%. So it's a 3% increase, and because of the increase, we would want to contract in popular podcasts. So by contracting in these popular podcasts, we can gain a wider range of demographics. So Cumulus right now kind of reaches like the middle age range of people, but by bringing in popular podcasts that target towards a younger demographic, we could bring in that new demographic for Cumulus to advertise to. It's also a win for podcasters because they would have a steady platform to broadcast on. So some of the podcasts that we're going to recommend are sporadically broadcasted through different channels, but we could give podcasters a steady platform to broadcast on and increase their profits while increasing ours. So which podcasts to contract? We want to contract podcasts that already have a large reach towards millennials and Generation Z. The average podcast revenue is suspected to increase as well, which shows that through podcasting, businesses that we contract in and podcasts that we can contract in will benefit from the advertising costs. So some suggestions that we could podcast in, these are just some popular podcasts. The LGBT Q&A and the Hilarious Humanitarians. These podcasts already reach a large range of people that are that are millennials and then younger than us. And they do this through iTunes right now, but you have to pay if you would like to get it. We could give them free streaming in exchange for their demographic. So it would create more ad revenues for Cumulus, and it would also be a better reach for the podcasters. Cumulus right now reaches around 245 million people a week, and this would have podcasters have the same reach that Cumulus has right now. So when should you start implementing this? So we, as a group, we kind of suggest that you start immediately implementing it. So the project launch would start with a research and selection process. So through the research and selection process, we would be able to narrow down the podcasts that we want to contract in. Through that, we would pitch to businesses and podcasters, make sure that they understand that their revenues will increase. The contracts then will come shortly after, and we would expect them to be finalized within a month. And the profits would happen at finalization. So once the contracts are all finalized, we would begin to bring in those podcasters, bring in those advertising revenues, so we would begin to see profits almost immediately. The cost is pretty efficient because as a podcaster has a large demographic that they reach already, and they already have the amount of consumers and people that like to listen to them. So it would be cost efficient for us because we don't actually have to create the podcast. We could just contract in. That way we would be able to maintain the app or maintain the podcast at a low price. It's way cheaper than creating it, and we would get that demographic. So we can't really predict the exact profit of this, but we suggest that the implementation begins immediately so you can start seeing profits. And yes, overall, it will end up showing a profit because of the cost efficiency and because of the fact that we can increase our ad revenues. So now I'm going to pass it off to Graham, and he is going to touch on our next recommendation.
So based on the current market trends, what we've researched, we recommend Netflix go the Cumulus Netflix for a partner. This allows for both sides and also allows you to get an edge on competitors, and something that has been successful was Spotify and Hulu's merger together. When Hulu was struggling to get new users, they had about roughly 3 million, and Spotify had roughly 36.3 million in 2016. After their deal, their Hulu's users went up to 17 million, and Spotify's went up to 7 million. That is close to a 50% increase afterwards. They offered Hulu free advertising across all their platforms, and Spotify in turn got reduced rates for Hulu services. So based off of that, we recommend that Netflix and Cumulus create a partnership with them. This would target millennials who use both services a lot, and it would be ideal. We would offer free advertising to Cumulus we would offer free advertising to Netflix across all of Cumulus' platforms, which reaches 245 million people a week. This would reduce their advertising cost overall, and all we would ask in return is that Netflix gives us reduced rates for our users. This would be a competitive advantage over our competitors because Cumulus has terrestrial stations, and that is something that Spotify does not with Hulu. So that'll wrap up our presentation. I would like to invite our team up for a Q&A.
As we did before, you all be asking the first questions, and then we'll follow up.
Why Netflix? There's other programs that you can use. Why Netflix?
Netflix has 117 million users, and based off the increase on Hulu, they are starting to put pressure on Netflix for users. So we want Netflix to basically compete with what is popular right now.
Just out of curiosity, of your 3 recommendations, which one do you think is like the most critical for Cumulus in their current financial state?
I'll take this one. I think that the music streaming app would be the most crucial because of the cash flows that would bring in. Also, their recommendations can combine with the music streaming app, such as if you purchase our music streaming app, we will get you a Netflix deal. Also, we can put the podcast through the music streaming app.
It's kind of like a combo.
Yes.
All 3 of us through the app.
Your second recommendation kind of talk about like podcasting a lot. Why are people going to prefer podcasting in the future?
I will take this one. I think that, the main demographic for podcasters right now is around like a more educated kind of demographic. So right now, as we move on, I feel like a secondary education is very important now, and it's kind of taboo if you don't go to college. It's like, what are you going to do, and things like that. So with the more education that people have, I think that they're going to begin to listen to more podcasts and get their information through that platform, yes.
Good?
Yeah.
With podcasting, I've got to follow up there. How do you manage the risks? In other words, with podcasts, you can get a podcaster who says something that's very controversial, very inflammatory, and how do you make sure you're not going to lose your advertisers or your listeners because they're offended?
Okay, that's actually something that I did do a lot of research into because we would mainly be targeting millennials and people after that who we know sometimes get offended easily. So through the LGBT Q&A, that is, I've actually listened to some of those podcasts, the Hilarious Humanitarians. They're more targeted towards a liberal demographic, which is kind of what we want to move towards for millennials.
But does that mean that you're going to be very selective about which advertisers appear during those podcasts? Are you going to basically pick and choose which advertisers you target for the podcast channels?
I feel like through our pitches, like to businesses and through their advertisements, obviously have to be tailored to a specific demographic, which would be the millennials. So I feel like through our target marketing, we would choose those businesses that fit in well with Cumulus and fit in well with the podcast that we would want to contract in. So yeah.
So I have a question with the stream. You said for the app you'd have unlimited songs, but have a streaming fee. So you said, what does that mean?
The streaming fee for every song that you stream, there's a data charge.
Okay. So what's the difference between just clicking a song and streaming a song, or is that the same?
It's the same thing. Just if you play the song, depending on how much of the song you play,
Okay,
how long
got it.
the
So you
song
play
is.
as many as you want, but it'll take some of your data.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
And the data wouldn't necessarily be charged right away. It would be when you play it. So we could have like an abundance, like a huge library of music, but it wouldn't actually start costing us until someone clicks that play button.
Okay.
Do a lot of the content, the music content providers, do any of them already have exclusive deals with other streaming services where you can't get access to their libraries? You know?
I feel like, I mean, you can get access. That's why I don't know any other companies where like you can't get access. That's why through Hulu and Spotify, they advertise. Hulu advertises through Hulu? Okay, yeah. Hulu will advertise through Spotify, and through that they get their listeners get a discounted
No,
Hulu.
I guess I mean like Warner Brothers Records.
Yeah.
Do they have any exclusive contracts with, let's say, Pandora or Spotify where it says, you can only stream our music through this service, we will not let any other service use our music? And I just don't know if that's common in the industry or not. Did you encounter any information about that?
I think we can search the answer after class and email you. So.
Okay, that's good. That's fine.
I can actually touch on that too. The only service I know that has exclusive rights to music, I know that Spotify has exclusive rights to the Beatles. They're the only ones that are allowed to play.
That's the kind of thing I'm curious about. How common is that? And will that restrict your ability to offer a broad spectrum of music or not?
I think it will restrict us at the beginning, but also like through the content change, we really want to make it heavy, like music and podcasting, talk shows, and everything. So I think that it will give us a competitive advantage that we will be the ones doing the podcasting. So if you want to access a popular podcast, then we would have the rights to that, and then you would come to us if you want to listen to podcasting. So ours is like kind of to monopolize on that.
Again, kudos to both teams today for thinking of all the costs, including storage of those songs as well as the bandwidth, because those are real costs, and you can at least estimate based on those numbers. This third recommendation, I'm intrigued with, this partnership with Netflix. It seems like a potential win-win, especially since you'd be relying on the Netflix app and you're taking advantage of their listener base. Do you think that Netflix, how would that work? Would it be like, would you give them wholesale access to your terrestrial radio network, or would there be certain markets they would be more interested in advertising in?
In order to try to grab their attention and sweeten the deal a little bit, it would probably be best to offer them all of our stations.
Okay. So you think Netflix as a service is ubiquitous enough that everybody coast to coast is going to have a desire for this service, and so, okay. Are there any other companies you've considered having a strategic partnership with besides Netflix?
We considered companies like Starbucks or McDonald's and food services, mainly to target millennials.
Yeah.
But after researching, it was too hard to come up with.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
Is there a reason you didn't include in that possible partnership, the idea of actually streaming Cumulus Radio through Netflix, or using their platform as a way to get into the, like where you just want to have background music, turn on Netflix rather than watching a movie, you can turn on a Cumulus station.
Based off of what Netflix is as a provider with TVs and movies, it's just not something we consider.
I think that is a really good idea, though. I mean, if you can stream through both services, then you're obviously going to increase your profits and your target.
It's sort of comparable to, if you go on most cable systems, there's a whole band of music stations, and they just sort of flip through the title is all that gets shown of what you're hearing at that moment. I was just wondering if Netflix would be a good way to get into households with the Cumulus brand and be able to then lead them to your streaming app and other subscription services and stuff.
And so, with the partnership, would it be you can do both of these for this reduced cost, or is it just if we have this partnership, then Netflix will be reduced to a specific cost?
I'll touch on this one. Currently, Netflix spent a lot of money on creating their own content, so they're currently in a lot of debt, not troubling debt, but they could definitely use some cost cut. So the way it would work is we would give them free advertising and in exchange they would give our members free monthly subscriptions.
Not free, right? Discounted?
Discounted.
Yes.
Right.
Not free.
Because
Not free. Not free.
if it's free,
Sorry.
I'm in.
Discounted, yeah.
Just so I understand, because Professor Coombs was asking a question, and I just want to make sure I was clear on it. Can I go to Netflix and bring up a Cumulus radio station? Is that the idea?
Well, we didn't really. That wasn't our recommendation, but
Oh.
it's really good and it makes sense. And like,
Well, I thought that's what the recommendation was. So what
the recommendation was to just use for Netflix to use our platform through Cumulus and use our streaming and our terrestrial to advertise.
Other way. Oh, I see.
Yeah, but I mean, it could be a win-win, and I like that.
In exchange, they offer Cumulus subscribers a discount on Netflix.
Well, okay. Yeah, because I can see the advantage to advertisers on Cumulus stations, right? They would then have access to all Netflix subscribers, even if it's local ads, right? For a local station, so I'm tuned into a station in Seattle, and maybe they're advertising some local merchants there, and I'm in Ohio, and it might like Starbucks, right? So there could be some applicability there. But if I'm from Seattle and I'm homesick, I may not mind hearing some of that stuff,
But it's really no different than people that stream their favorite radio station.
Right.
Yeah. So for future reference, you could work that in two directions, right? So you would do both. Why not? If you can make it work.
I had a question about the podcast. You said something about free streaming in exchange to play their podcast.
Free streaming in exchange to play their podcast.
Is that right?
It would be more of like if we contract in these podcasts, they will have a steady platform. So like some of the podcasts that we talked about are only like sporadically broadcasted through different channels, but we could give them like a home kind of and make them, you have to come to Cumulus if you want to listen to this podcast. This is the only way you can get it.
What's the
so it'd be exclusive.
Yeah, but we would try to make the contracts like
And have you
exclusive.
seen any research of that happening with other competitors?
I haven't seen any research.
How did you
I thought
come
that
up with that idea?
the reason why we came up with it is because we saw advertisements and podcast listenership going up in the future, and we were like, if we can capitalize on the podcast right now, we can make a profit in the future.
And that's through your streaming app, not through your broadcast terrestrials.
Well, I mean, we could broadcast through all of the channels that Cumulus has available. I think that would be more beneficial, but it would mainly be focused on the online app.
So, because my question then becomes, how do you work the revenue model? I mean, I can see if you put it on only through your streaming, you can track popularity and the compensation moves with the popularity of the podcast. Where if you're putting it out through the broadcast, the terrestrial thing, how do you know if anybody's really listening or not? And then how do you pay the podcaster based on performance, if you will. And also, again, I think the risks increase exponentially when you go to the terrestrial, because anybody that happens to flip through that station could hear something that they may really have a problem with, where if I'm on the streaming service, I'm choosing to listen to that podcast.
I think that the main thing we want to touch on is like definitely going through the online streaming. So like the podcast would mainly be centered towards people that I want to listen to this and I get to choose it now, and this is when I want to stream it, and this is where I want to stream it from. So the podcast listenership would basically be through online streaming. I don't know how much it'll really reach through the terrestrial, but we could definitely measure it through the online streaming. I think that that will be the most profitable and where the most people will listen.
Good. Make sure you've got whatever you need to recover from the computer, like